to a Monticello live stream. I'm Melanie Boyer, and I am joined today by Derek Baxter. Derek is an author and traveler, author of the book In Pursuit of Jefferson, with the Most Perplexing Founding Father. He's going to talk about his book today and some of the things that he discovered about Jefferson and himself on his travels. Please leave any questions that you might have for Derek in the comments section and let us know where you're joining from. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Derek.
Well, great. Thank you, Melanie. And thanks everybody for listening. So I wanted to tell you about the travels that led to this book and kind of, why I wrote it and what I experienced out on the road. This book gave me the chance to explore a different side of Jefferson's life that we don't always think about as much. So, we probably all know the Thomas Jefferson of Philadelphia who wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was only 33. Or the older Jefferson as president, and all his accomplishments then. But in between is the middle-aged Jefferson of the 1780s when he went to Europe to be the minister to France, to be an ambassador. It's a time in his life that doesn't get quite as much attention, but I think was a real transformative time in his life and really shaped him to be the person that we know. And his time in Europe almost didn't happen. He had been asked twice to go serve as an ambassador, and he had declined both times. He was happy in Virginia. He was with his wife, who was sometimes had delicate health. But two things happened that pushed him to take this trip. Two very dark things. So one was his problems in the war. So Jefferson, as you may know, was governor of Virginia during the Revolution for 2 years. And for all his talents, Jefferson, he wasn't a born wartime governor. He had trouble bringing up the Virginia State Militia and getting enough arms, and the British overran the state. And in fact, he was almost captured here at Monticello. And I love how Monticello in the past has put on this ceremony, this performance of the British Dragoons in June 1781, charging up the hill, and they came within a minute or so of taking him prisoner. So this is a big political embarrassment for Jefferson, and his opponents pounced on it and criticized him harshly. And Jefferson was somewhat sensitive to criticism, and it stung, and he swore off politics. He was kind of embittered. He said he was going to go back to his farm and his family, his friends and fields, and nothing would ever separate him from them again. And people didn't even know at the time. It was not well known that he had written the Declaration of Independence. Even that fact had been kept a bit of a secret because the people in Congress wanted the document to seem like it was a consensus work. So his political star had fallen. He's not the famous Jefferson we know today. And then, even worse, his wife, Martha, died in 1782 following a difficult childbirth. And he wrote afterwards that their marriage had been 10 years of uncheckered happiness. And after her death, he was just in a stupor of mind. He even wrote to one friend that seemed to imply that he was contemplating suicide. So Jefferson was in a very dark place in his life. And it was at this point that James Madison recognized that what Jefferson really needed was a change of scenery. So he arranged for the Congress to ask him a third time if he wouldn't go to Europe. And this time he accepted. And he wound up staying in Paris for 5 years. And it was there, I think, in France that he came into his own. I mean, you can tell in this famous painting of him in Paris, Jefferson he's changed. He's got confidence. He's wearing the French clothing, the ruffles. You can see the artwork, the statuary in the background. So he just fell in love with Paris. He had a bit of a rocky start. He was sick a lot at first, but he was homesick too for America. But as he spent more time, he grew to love Paris more and more. And he went to the intellectual salons and debated the issues of the day. And he learned all about art and architecture and politics and all these different parts of culture, aspects of culture that he couldn't experience back home. And his confidence came back. He learned all these ideas, new ideas that he would bring back and shape and make them different back home. And of course, he would rise again and become the Jefferson that we all know. So it was in the course of all this that towards the end of his stay in Paris in 1788, when two young Americans showed up at his doorstep. These were friends, these were sons of friends of his back home. And they were going to take the grand tour. They're going to go all over Europe. And who better to ask for travel advice than our man in Paris, than the American ambassador? And so Jefferson wrote them a 5,000 word letter, which really serves in effect as a guide. It wasn't published as a guidebook, but it's basically long enough to serve as a guide. And he even gave it a title, Hints to Americans Traveling in Europe. And this guide that he wrote sketched out an itinerary. There's part of it you can see on this map here, with places to go and cities to stop in and subjects to investigate. He also had a lot of knowledge from his tour in England. So I should mention Jefferson took 3 long trips away from Paris while he lived there. One was to England, where he joined John Adams and did some diplomatic work and then traveled all around the country. One was up here to Amsterdam, where he also met up with John Adams to do some diplomatic work. And then the third was just purely for pleasure. And it was down south to the south of France and Italy and back to Paris. So he had all this travel information. Jefferson took lots of notes. He had all this information at the ready, and he shared it with these 2 young men in his guide. And I think it's just a fascinating document. It hasn't been ignored through the years, but not a lot has been written on it. And I came across this guide a number of years back, and I'll get to the subjects of the guide in a minute. But I'd always looked up to Jefferson, and I think at this point in my life, this was a number of years ago, I was kind of hitting middle age. I was looking for some kind of challenge, and this guide really spoke to me, in part because of the identity of the person who wrote it, Thomas Jefferson. He was my hero growing up here in Virginia, but also just about how interesting it seemed. It seemed as if Jefferson had just sketched out all these incredible things for a traveler to do, and he called it To Americans Traveling in Europe, which I counted myself, hey, I'm an American and I would love to travel to Europe. So I began to study this guide and look at the different subjects that he highlighted. And so, in fact, if anyone is listening and able to throw something there on the comment page, I have a question for you. And I've got a giveaway of this map that I can send to you afterwards. So I'm curious of all these different objects of attention that he set out. So here are the 8 different subjects you can see, if you can see it on the screen, everywhere from agriculture to manufacturing, to garden, architecture, painting, politics, courts. So which of these do you think Jefferson wrote was, quote, worth great attention? I mean, he liked several of these objects that he thought an American traveler should really learn about, but one of them in particular he highlighted as being worth great attention. See if there are any takers. Architecture. Okay, I see Chester from Hopewell said architecture. That's exactly right on the first try. There you go. So Chester, I'll send you the map if you want to go to my website, which is jeffersontravels.com. You can see a place where you can enter your email to get my newsletter, and just mention that, and I'll get the map out to you. Other great guesses. Some other people were on architecture right after Chester. Agriculture too was a topic he was very, very interested in as well. But that's what he wrote about. Okay, so here's another part of our pop quiz. This other subject, Jefferson basically poo-pooed and said it's too expensive for Americans. It would be, quote, useless and preposterous for an American to learn about this subject. See if anyone can take a guess at this. What would be useless for the American traveler to even try to learn about back in the 1780s? So we have art. That's right. Elaine Elaine got that. It was painting and statuary. Although Jefferson wound up buying some painting and statuary himself. And I think, and one of the travelers who followed his guide, I think ironically enough, introduced Jefferson to some subjects of paintings that he liked, very practical paintings, historical paintings. But he thought that our state of play back then was just, we were nowhere near ready to imitate Europe in art. So then my last question for you is, which of these subjects do you think Jefferson thought was worth learning about because it showed, quote, the weakest and the worst part of mankind? So if you think you've got this, put it in the comments. I might be waiting for them to load. Number 8. Yes, that's right. Tom Shroud has got it. It's royal courts. That was one of Jefferson's fears, that these young travelers would actually, want to emulate them. So he definitely wanted them to make sure when they're going to these royal palaces, they shouldn't like what they're seeing. So thanks, folks. I'm going to have one more later in the presentation too. And as I said, just go to my website and Chester, Elaine, and Tom and drop me an email there. So continuing on, so I was, I became very interested in the guide. And as I said, I was looking for this challenge, and I started to think to myself, what if I just took this guide and followed it? What would happen? What would I learn about all these subjects? Would I learn something about Jefferson or even myself? So I kind of thought through the prospect. This was a while back. I guess it's been about a decade now. And I was thinking about the pros and cons, and some of the cons being, I wasn't in a position, I had 2 young kids at home where I could just, pack up and quit the job and travel around Europe for a year. There's a lot to see, but I certainly couldn't do that. So I thought I would have to take these trips one at a time and kind of break up his itinerary piece by piece. And as I thought about it, I was kind of on the fence. And one thing that certainly seemed like it would be a major challenge was the subject of wine. So wine was a major theme in his guide. He listed 13 different wines, and I was thinking through, how would I learn about wine? And I'm going to read you just a short passage from my book, because one question I had from the outset was just, why did Jefferson care so much about wine? I mean, he seems like he's a pretty serious guy. So why all this attention to wine? And so here's a bit of what I found out from my research. Jefferson's travels through southern France, as well as Italy and Germany, formed part of his quest for the perfect bottle of wine. This wasn't just so he could lay out the best table in America, although he would do that too. Until independence, Americans had drunk only rough, overly sweet Madeira, forced on them by the English and their restrictive trade policies. Now the wines of France were open to American importers. But which ones were the best? There were no printed guides. Jefferson would have to make discoveries for himself. The grapes he selected might even be grown back in America. Jefferson worried that the fastest growing drink in popularity back home was corn whiskey. He didn't want his beloved yeoman farmers going on benders. He imagined them sipping fine yet affordable wines by the fire at night, reading Virgil in the original Latin and discussing democracy. So Jefferson rambled through the vineyards, as he put it, talking to vintners, observing winemaking, and finding deals. He recorded how women plucked snails off the grapes and how men grafted vines. He bought vine cuttings to experiment with in his garden and bottles to sample at home. These were the happiest days of his life, he wrote later. After his trip, Jefferson would use his rankings of Bordeaux to guide his purchases, which he made directly with the winery wherever possible. Middlemen inevitably cheated the consumer, he wrote, adulterating wine, switching vintages and producers, and storing it poorly. Only the producer itself provided the genuine article. He would travel home from France with 363 bottles in tow, mostly white Bordeaux. And that was just for his immediate use. The rest of his vast wine collection was shipped in crates. So it was an important topic for him. And in particular, I was kind of scratching my head, how am I going to get to Bordeaux? So you see that back here on the map. Bordeaux in southwest France. It's where, of course, where I've got the wine bottle and glass in the corner of the map. And if you know anything about wine, you probably know Bordeaux is just about the most exclusive wine region in the world. And this is a major part of Jefferson's travels. He, in fact, did this very early classification of Bordeaux wines. So I knew I had to go, but you can't just walk into Bordeaux, these wineries, and just show up and do a tasting. And then I stumbled upon something on the internet. It turns out there's a marathon run every year, the Marathon du Médoc, which goes through Bordeaux. And all these chateaus, these exclusive chateaus, open their gates for one day only to runners, and they actually serve the wine as you run. So there is a catch. You get to visit them and taste the wine, but you have to run a marathon while you do it, and you have to run in costume. But I decided this was my way in, and I decided a decade ago I had to go that year because the theme of the costumes that year was history. So I did my best to dress as Jefferson, and there I am with my wife Liana, dressed as a colonial woman, and we decided to run the marathon. And I'm going to read you another brief pass from the book about running this. We're trying to learn all about Jefferson and have these Jeffersonian experiences while we tried the wine. So I was thinking about the history. I was thinking about how William Short, who was one of the young men who followed Jefferson's travel guide back in 1788, he went to Bordeaux. He was Jefferson's private secretary and assistant. And in fact, in Bordeaux, Short actually wrote to Jefferson asking for career advice. So I had a lot of history back in my mind, but really, as we went through this race, we were also just trying to survive. It was a real marathon, and it was pretty tough because we had never run anything like that before. By now, the small sips of Bordeaux no longer dull the throbbing in our knees or the blistering on our feet, and even the mild, whiny buzz has disappeared. "Allez, Liana!" call out the spectators, who look concerned. Her name is on her running bib, but I wonder why she's garnering such attention. Then I see that she's as bright red as a nice Cabernet Sauvignon. Despite all the pageantry and wine, it's still a marathon, our first, and doubts about this whole expedition creep in. How would it bode for any plans of following Hints to Americans if we fail on this inaugural leg? We walk briskly. I know we're north of 6 hours into the race, closing in on the 7-hour limit. So they had this limit, which is a long time to run a real marathon, it's true. But if you fell behind, there were these 3 French runners called the sweepers. So if you fell behind them, they were running at the slowest pace you can run, then you're out of the race. And gendarmes could actually load you into a van. A tent with the flag proclaiming kilometer 38 is a welcome sight. We're on the home stretch, and it's time for the most famous stop on the journey. A table piled high with heaps of mottled oysters. A man with a proud white mustache and sun-browned arms shucks them at a snail's pace. I drink white Sauterne, poured from a plastic water bottle. It tastes different from everything we've had before, tropical, like lychees and passion fruit. Jefferson loved this sweet wine so much that he would order it his whole life, sending bottles to George Washington as a present. The lush Sauterne almost puts me in a trance. If only I could lie down, stop running, and drink some more, preferably listening to sitar music. I reach my hand out for seconds. Liana shouts to me from the edge of the tent. I can't hear her, but manage a Gallic shrug, smile weakly, and take another swig. Liana looks upset as if she had eaten a bad oyster and points dramatically at a hill as if to say, "J'accuse!" I follow her finger. High, cresting a distant hilltop 100 meters ahead of us, run the 3 sweepers. Behind them, a gaggle of runners practically cling to the trio's capes, begging for penance. The sweepers and their acolytes disappear over the hill, crushing the juice from our dreams. We're about to be placed in a van and hauled back to the starting line. My Hints test run a failure. On Monday, I'll be back on the commuter train, getting to work by 9 for another week of sameness. Just like those Bordeaux wines, I'll be confined in a classification that's impossible to break out of. My mind flashes to Jefferson, and I think about William Short and the advice he sought from his mentor. He too traveled to Bordeaux with a troubled mind, torn about his own future. Should he remain in Paris long-term or follow his dream of running for office back home? He was afraid that if he chose wrong, he'd have to resign himself to a life he hadn't wanted. Consider carefully, Jefferson counseled in a return letter. He would be sorry to lose Short as his secretary, but the young man had to find his own path to durable happiness. It won't be easy. It will certainly involve hard work. This is not a world in which heaven rains riches into any hand that will open itself, Jefferson wrote. Whichever of these courses you adopt, delay is loss of time. The sooner the race is begun, the sooner the prize will be obtained. Merde, I feel an almost electric jolt course through me. I'm not ready to abandon this race, this prize, this pursuit of happiness. Without a word, Liana and I rushed forward, revolutionaries storming the barricades. We put pain out of mind. We charge up the hill, sweeping past the sweepers. On a runner's high, blisters and heat forgotten, we clock our fastest kilometer as the Grand Gironde River comes into sight. My cape flies crisp in the wind, our hearts pound in unison, our minds drag our exhausted bodies behind them. Allez, Liana! She's purple like Merlot and determined. Loud French music blares, people clock. The clock ticks 7 hours. We cross the line holding hands. We finish the marathon. Now the hard journey begins. So the marathon, we did survive and we did finish it just in time. And it was a life-changing experience. And we liked the trip so much. I felt like I did make some Jeffersonian connections. I wanted to continue it. And so we did. So over the years, I took, I think 8 more trips to Europe. And we tended to try to take about a trip a year. And each trip I'd explore a different subject. And I wound up writing a book about it. So it's both travel and history. It's the reading I gave you was a little more slanted toward the travel side of it, but it winds up being about half Jefferson and half my own experiences. So here we are. This is one of the next trips we took to Amsterdam. This is the very first stop in Jefferson's travel guide in Hints to Americans Traveling in Europe. And I'd never been before. This was a really kind of almost magical city to me. And Liana and I visited on this festival called King's Day, which is the day they celebrate the royal family of the House of Orange. So people are all supposed to wear orange. And Jefferson actually did something similar, it turns out. When he visited Amsterdam, it was also the Prince of Orange's birthday. And he wrote about the firework display he saw and about how he had to put on this orange cockade in celebration. So we traveled through Amsterdam, and since this is at the beginning of his travel guide, I thought it was a really good place to learn how to travel like Jefferson, because he put all of these very practical travel tips in his guide. And I think a lot of them even stand the test of time today. So Jefferson said, the first thing to do when you get to a city that you've never been to before is to buy a map, which seems logical enough, and then to buy a guidebook. Because he was there in the days of the Grand Tour when these maps and guidebooks were first coming out, and tourists were they were catering to tourists. So he thought you should get practical information, and then he said the next thing is to go to the highest point you can find in a city. So it could be, in his case, in his day, the city walls or the steeple of a church. His thought was you should look down below and get kind of an aerial view like you would with a Google Earth satellite photo today. So you've got an idea of how the city fits together in your mind. And then Jefferson wrote, you should go out there and gulp down culture. I see somebody in the comments mentioned Jefferson's interactions with Lafayette. And he wrote this in a letter to Lafayette that he liked to gulp down culture in a day. But Jefferson, he was a great traveler, and he wrote that you should, if you're debating in your mind, do you have time to go see something? Remember, you might never be there again. So it was really kind of a carpe diem approach. If you want to do something while you're there, you better do it. But he also showed on the other side, he wrote, look for balance. You can't possibly see everything. So when you're traveling, don't try to go to a museum and see every single object in it. It would burden your mind, he wrote. So find that balance. And when you've gulped down culture, go out there and take more time and really get to know the place. Try to get to know the place as you're passing through. Get to know the real people. So he recommended going to the markets. The public markets, he said, were a place where you could see people from high to low and engage with them. And this is the part of his advice that I think I love the most. He wrote, when in a tavern, don't order foreign wine. It's just going to be marked up. It's probably not going to be the real thing. So basically, drink what everybody else is having. So Jefferson really wanted people to even drink local. So I took these travel tips and I used them on a whole series of different trips throughout the years, and got to learn about different subjects. So here we are in Italy. This had to be one of the most popular of our trips. Jefferson wrote that he was on a continued feast when he went through Italy, and he was looking for a lot of things, but he was really exploring both foods to bring back home and crops that could be planted. So here I am with my kids who went on many of these trips with us in Gragnano, which is a town near Naples. Jefferson had William Short buy him a macaroni maker in Naples, and this town is the center, is like the homeland for Italian artisanal pasta. So we're taking a tour of it and learning about it. Jefferson helped popularize pasta. He wasn't the first person to bring it back, of course, but he did serve it in the president's house. And one very surprised guest tried it and thought he was eating elongated onions. So not everybody knew what macaroni was supposed to taste like yet. Another thing Jefferson did in his travels through Italy was become a rice smuggler. He learned that there was a special variety of rice. Well, he actually wanted to know what it was. He knew that Italian rice from the Piedmont region was selling much better in France than rice from the Carolinas was. But he didn't know if it was a different variety or if it was processed different. So he went there in person to find out. That was really his excuse for going to Italy in the first place. But what he found out when he got to Italy was that it was a different variety, but that it was illegal to export the rice unprocessed. They were really trying to, guard their secrets. And the penalty was nothing less than the death penalty. But Jefferson actually stuffed his pockets with grains and put some more in a sack and took them out anyway and sent them to planters in the Carolinas, who then told him, thanks, but no thanks. We like what we're growing just fine. And please stop sending this rice because it might mix with the one we had. So not all of his experiments worked. But we had a wonderful trip through Italy. We also explored the gardens of England and landscape gardening, which was also a tremendous influence on Jefferson. English gardens were basically the only thing he pretty much liked of what he saw in England. But he took a lot of landscape ideas back home. And we explored natural history. So Jefferson he wrote at one point, I do not know the fishy tribes. But as an ambassador, one of the things he had to do was promote American fishing and whaling, our commercial interests. And he wanted to learn about it. He always wanted to learn the scientific foundation of what he was exploring. So he wrote at one point, science never appears so beautiful as when applied to the uses of human life. So Jefferson wanted to learn more about fishing and whaling and better techniques and just where the prey went, but also about all sorts of different scientific questions as he traveled. He even invented a plow from the back of his carriage. When he observed a farmer using a plow that seemed to him to be very inefficient. He investigated climate. Jefferson was really interested in climate and comparing the climate of Europe with that of North America. So he was constantly taking weather observations and encouraging others to do as well. But then we get to what we talked about earlier when we were talking about these different subjects, what was Jefferson's, what he thought was particularly worth great attention, which is architecture. And so here will be my other giveaway in terms of who can recognize or identify this building. See if there's any takers. This is a tough one, and I think maybe only one person out of 10 or so, 10 times I've tried this has gotten it. But Peggy Cornett has who is a bit of a ringer here, as she is she's worked for many years and done all this wonderful stuff at Monticello, but you're absolutely right, Peggy. It is the first Monticello, and I will send you another copy of the map. So this first copy of Monticello, you know, it looks nothing like Monticello. He really hadn't gotten into his architectural vision at all. You can tell this is very boxy. It doesn't have the dome. You know, it's not something, you know, you really want to put on a nickel. So because Jefferson, it's you know, it was still a very unique approach to building, but he was taking this directly. He was copying drawings from Palladio's 4 books of architecture. And so it was when he got to Europe that he really expanded his architectural vision. So here you see a building that looks a lot closer to the Monticello we know and love. This is the Hôtel de Salm in Paris, which was a building which was being constructed basically the same years that Jefferson lived in Paris. So he got to see it being built, and Jefferson would go down and sit in a lawn chair in the Tuileries on the right bank of Paris, not too far from where he lived on the Champs-Élysées, and he'd crane his neck across the Seine to watch this building be rising near where not too far from where the Eiffel Tower is today. And Jefferson wrote he'd come home with a neck ache because he spent so much time trying to understand it. So this was an example of French neoclassical architecture, which was a new movement, which he couldn't get from books at all. And it emphasized some different techniques that Jefferson, you know, very eagerly learned about. They emphasized, of course, domes and skylights, which he would bring these ideas back. The French neoclassical architects, they didn't want to be very ostentatious. They wanted to make everything look harmonious and a little modest, you know, as modest as a mansion could be. So, for example, the Hôtel de Salm played with, you know, played with things so it looked like it was only one story. And Jefferson, of course, did the same thing at Monticello. He hid the third story behind a balustrade, and he put the second floor windows very close to the ground, so they almost look like they're the first floor windows. So you can see Monticello also looks like it's just one building. As he traveled, Jefferson also looks for the finest building materials. So here I am in Carrara, Italy, which is the source of the finest marble in the world. Michelangelo used it. Jefferson asked William Short to commission a piece, a marble chimney piece for Monticello there. So he would use that building material, but only it was very expensive, only for the finest touches. So this is an older picture of Monticello, and really he was able to put all these things together when he came home and rebuilt his house. He used not just Carrara, but he used the signature building element, of course, in Virginia was bricks made out of Virginia red clay. But he took all these ideas, the French neoclassical architecture and the Roman buildings he had seen and the materials, and used his own vision, you know, to come up with Monticello and the other incredible buildings he designed. And I think Jefferson, you know, had such an influence on our architecture, you know, our public architecture. You see everything from government buildings to banks, whatever, that are modeled on neoclassical architecture. It didn't have to be that way. And I think Jefferson, thanks to his travels in Europe, really has as much as anyone in our history to thank for that. I will say, of course, you know, the travels had been just a source of joy and a lot of personal growth. And my family went along and we all saw things differently and loved to travel, loved the subjects we learned about. But I realized as I went on that something was missing from the story, that I wasn't seeing the full story. So Jefferson never talked about slavery in his guide. He didn't mention it once. And I knew, obviously, we know Jefferson's a slave owner. And that fact had always disappointed me, ever since I was a child. It made me uncomfortable. But I didn't think this was going to be the major focus of my travels. I was looking into all these subjects. But as I went on, I realized that I was wrong, that slavery was part of who Jefferson was. And it was tied up in all of his travels. All these projects I've been talking about, he was dependent on the work of enslaved people to carry them out. So the wonderful buildings, he was dreaming them up, but they were being built by, in many cases, by enslaved people and free people, but so much work being done by his slaves. And on the landscape gardening, even the rice that he brought upland rice back to grow in Monticello that was, of course, planted by enslaved people. So everything, all of his dreams were dependent on slave labor. His money was too. He drew a salary as our ambassador, but what really paid his bills throughout his life was tobacco picked by enslaved people at his plantations. And as I researched and dug deeper into this time in Jefferson's life, I found a couple of things that really saddened me. One was that he ran low on money in France, and in January of 1785, he actually authorized the sale of 31 people. So it was something that Jefferson did do from time to time, was actually sell people when he needed to pay off his creditors. So it's a tough thing to get your head around. And the other, I think disappointing thing for me was that it was during this period that Jefferson had been an advocate for emancipation of slaves, gradual emancipation, but he had pushed measures both in Virginia and in the U.S. Congress, and he started to walk that back. And by the time he got back from Paris, he was no longer a public advocate for emancipation. And I think it's because he had grown deeper and deeper into debt, and didn't see any possibility of pushing that issue for himself. So slavery, it's a very difficult issue. It's one that we have to think about. And we have to reckon with, because it's certainly part of our history, part of Jefferson's history, part, as it turned out, even of his travels. And at one point, I even put my following the travels in Europe on hold, and I began to instead focus on trying to learn more about the lives of some of the enslaved people who lived there on the mountain with Jefferson, and their own lives, their own travels. So this is Isaac Granger, an enslaved tinsmith and blacksmith who Jefferson actually gave to his daughter, passed on the human property to his daughter, and who did eventually obtain his freedom. But I was particularly struck by this story, and I write about several stories of several enslaved people and their travels as well, but of Peter Fawcett, who I give credit to Cinder Stanton, the longtime Monticello historian, and others working on the Getting Word project to uncover this amazing story of Peter Fawcett, who was a Hemmings. Jefferson owned over 600 people in his lifetime, and he only formally freed seven of them, all of whom were members of the Hemmings family. Peter Fawcett was not formally freed by Jefferson. His father was, but Peter, at the age of 11, was part of the sale of enslaved people at Monticello after Jefferson's death. He was sold to an owner who was particularly cruel, who whipped him, who didn't allow the young Peter to learn how to read. He tried running away. He was caught. Eventually, his father, Joseph, who was at that time a freed blacksmith in Charlottesville, managed to buy his freedom with some help from his friends. And they moved to Ohio, where Peter became a reverend. He ran a prominent catering business. He worked on the Underground Railroad. And it's a story that Cinder Stanton tells. Peter had been sold as a slave and on Monticello's West Lawn. But he got to come back to Monticello as an old man. By this time, the Levy family had bought Monticello, a Jewish family very inspired by Jefferson's commitment to religious freedom. And they welcomed Peter Fawcett as an old man in his 80s back to Monticello, and he got to walk through the front door. So learning about Jefferson, by the end of my travels, I didn't see him quite with those kind of rose-colored glasses that I had as a child growing up. Not at all. I see him with a much more complicated legacy. But I'm glad that I got to learn about him and got to learn about some of the other people who lived on Monticello as well and had their own lives and travels. And I still do appreciate, though, many things that Jefferson handed down to us, despite all his flaws. This commitment to religious liberty, the commitment to science and pushing that forward. And I guess in my own case, the fact that he wrote what I thought were some damn good hints to Americans traveling in Europe. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Hi, Derek. I'm welcoming myself back here, but this was fascinating. Thank you so much. I just wanted to pull a couple, if I could, from the comments to ask you questions. There was one that we had from Rochelle that asked, how long would Jefferson spend in each country?
Sure. So he was in France for about 5 years, and he had these 3 long trips. So the first was to England, where he was there for just about a couple of months. So he went there to help John Adams on some diplomacy. He met King George III. That meeting did not go well. The king was not ready to let bygones be bygones. So his work part was kind of a bust, but he got to travel around with John Adams and visit all of these landscape gardens. So he was there for a couple of months. His longest trip away from Paris was this trip to the south of France. It was in Italy, which was about 3.5 months. And then his last trip was to Amsterdam and Germany. And when I say Germany and Italy, they weren't unified countries at the time. These were a lot of small little states. So he got to experience many different states by traveling, little kingdoms and duchies and things like that.
Great. Well, Tom asks, well, first he says, such a terrific book. And then he says, if you were to travel the routes again, what would you do differently and why?
That'll have to be for the sequel. What would I do? The one thing I was well, there are a couple of things I didn't quite get to. There's so much in that travel guide. In fact, we had planned for one last great trip, and it was going to be to France in the summer of 2020. So that trip never happened. And we were going to go on the Canal du Midi, which Jefferson did. It's this canal that links up with another canal and takes you basically from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast of France. It's a beautiful, Jefferson just loved this. So I would have loved to have done that. But we couldn't with the pandemic. And instead, I don't want to spoil the book, but I found another way to do a different kind of travel and to end the book that way. Because I think that was one of Jefferson's lessons, was kind of, make the most of whatever your situation was. He had wanted to go back to Europe himself, actually. He had planned to go back and travel to Italy and spend some more time, and also travel to Greece, which he never got to. But when he came home in 1789, just temporarily, he thought, to put some of his business affairs in order, and he planned to return, but he got the call to be Secretary of State, and the rest is history. Right. Instead, Jefferson always found a way to travel, including as an older man. He traveled all over Virginia, and in his 70s, actually went to the Peaks of Otter, this mountain range in central Virginia, and measured the height of the mountains. So he never quit, looking for things to do, no matter where you are. So
true. We also have an email from Stephanie asking if we know if Meriwether Lewis ever read Jefferson's guidebook.
Well, that's a great question. I don't have any proof that he did. So he kept a copy of it. So there were originally these 2 young men that were following it, and then he made a copy and gave William Short, his private secretary, a copy at that time, and he kept it with him. I don't have any evidence that he gave it to anyone else. I will say a couple of things. He did, obviously, for Lewis and Clark, he wrote detailed instructions about what he wanted them to see and to find, which I think was a similar approach he took to hints. And I guess I'll also mention that Jefferson loved his travels in Europe and his time in France, and he would tell stories about it his whole life. So I'm not sure he ever gave the guide out, but he kept it for his reference. And Daniel Webster, I think, talked about how even as a very old man, Jefferson would sit there in Monticello at his dining table, just regaling people with stories of Europe. So it certainly made a tremendous impression on him.
Great. Well, Tom said maybe the sequel should be with Bill Barker.
Well, yes, Bill would be an ideal person to do that. Absolutely. Well, I love all of Bill's presentations.
Yes. Well, I had another question too. I mean, first of all, I'm so impressed with the marathon story. I don't know how y'all made it through that, but it's very impressive to you and your wife on that. Your family, you mentioned, came with you on many of your travels. Like, what did they think about this? What were some of their reactions to the trip?
Yeah, well, my wife was definitely a sport to do the marathon, but it was such a great experience. So we're so glad we did it, and I'm glad we did it 10 years ago, so I wouldn't have to try to do it now. That really was a bucket list experience. I think, but we all came together as a family. I think this was really kind of the thing, such a thing that we shared. And obviously, we're very fortunate to be able to take these trips. I don't take that at all lightly. And we all experienced them, I think, in a different way. So my kids were pretty young at the beginning of these travels, and so they kind of grew up on these travels. And my daughter Miranda, in particular, really loved the food that she experienced, especially in Italy. And she wound up turning into a cook. So she came home and started trying to make the spaghetti, like the carbonara that we had tried. So it just kind of gave her this insight into all this food culture. And my son, I think, was the only one of us who truly loved the landscape gardens. That was kind of a controversial trip for us, as we saw all 19 gardens that Jefferson did.
Wow, that is a lot.
But yes, I think everyone was dragging. I don't know what number it took, but everybody had their own number. And after that, they were kind of like done with the gardens. Sure. Except for Nico, my son, who did enjoy it. And he particularly just the geography too. He became a real geography buff and just loves to pore over maps and things like that. So it is such a fortunate thing to be able to travel with your family. It doesn't have to be an elaborate trip to Europe. It can just be wherever you go. We're just very glad to be able to share that.
That's fantastic. And, imagine you started this maybe lifetime love in your son of landscape gardening. So that's pretty cool.
Exactly.
There was another question from Melissa, and she asked, are there any plaques and markers of Jefferson at any of the spots you visited in Europe?
So there are a few. So there's a statue of Jefferson in Paris, pretty close to the building I show, the picture, the Hôtel de Salm, which is today is a museum. And there's a fairly new, like the last 10 years or so, I think, a statue of him kind of looking out at the building, just like he did in real life, which is great. And I think the American Embassy actually in France has put plaques at a couple of places. So Jefferson is, I didn't know that people would necessarily know about him in France, but he's very well known. He's, is like a symbol of like Franco-American relations and stuff like that. So there are a few things, not too much, but a few things. But there is such great scholarship and that's been done. Jefferson, recorded everything just about. So he put on his memorandum books, he would record all his expenses, and scholars have taken so much time to detail, to explain just what the expenses were for and where they're at. So there's a lot of great information online even that you can just find. If you're really curious, what did Jefferson do when he got to Amsterdam, you can look up and you can find he bought a waffle maker, he ate oysters, just whatever he spent money on there is still recorded for posterity.
Okay. Let me see. I think we've got time for one more question. This has been fascinating, by the way. Thank you so much for joining us. I just love this. Let me ask you, what were some of your best moments or your favorite moments on this trip following in his footsteps?
Yeah, there were so many. I think, I've mentioned a couple of the places. Just Amsterdam was such a blast. We really enjoyed discovering that. The south of France was beautiful. But I think one of the places we had right up there was this little town called Séorges in the Alps in France, which on the French side, which we never would have gone to before. It's just a small little village, but it was right there in the guidebook. And Jefferson really pumped it up. He wrote about like, this is the most superb place you're gonna see, and it was just absolutely breathtaking. It's this village where all the houses are made out of stone and they're just almost hanging to the side of a cliff because there's so little land. And, they go back to medieval times, and there'd be different families living in different stories of each house. Like one family would enter at a lower level and another in the middle. So you just feel like you've stepped back in time. And Jefferson, he went there and he explored, and he was doing his science. He was really curious at what elevation olive trees would stop growing. So he was combining science with these very lyrical passages about it. So we went there and spent a couple of days, never would have gone there, as I said. And this was just like pretty much our favorite experience for all of us. So I think that was certainly one of the lessons of the travels was, it doesn't have to be the big place like Paris and London. It can just be an out of the way place that can just be really special. So yeah, that would be high up there.
That's great. Well, I think we've gone over a little bit on our time, but is there anything else you'd like to share just to wrap anything up?
Well, thanks everybody for listening and participating, and for Monticello for hosting this. I'm very grateful for all the time I spent in Monticello researching, and I write a bit about Monticello and about UVA and Poplar Forest and some of the other places where I try to show how Jefferson came up with the various ideas in Europe and then tried to put them into practice here at home, especially in Virginia. So the book is it's a blend of travel and history, and there's some of Virginia too. You can certainly, if you're interested in learning more, you can go. My website is jeffersontravels.com, so you can find some pictures of my travels. And I guess the last thing I'll say is I put starting to put a little practical information, because I get asked a lot. My wife and I get asked, okay, we want to do the exact trip you did. Like, where should I go and how do I do it? So I've started to put a few things like, you can go here, and this is exactly what Jefferson did in, say, Amsterdam. And you can try to experience that too. So you can check some of that stuff out if you're interested.
That's fantastic. And I put a link to your book in the comments, as well as to your website, so people can go there and check it out and buy a copy of your book as well. Again, thank you so much for being with us, Derek. This was fascinating. I can't wait to read the book myself. And I appreciate you taking your time to talk to us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining at home. Great questions. Thank you for participating in the quizzes. I thought that was so much fun. And join us next week for another Monticello live stream. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.